For this assignment, I'm focusing on the businessman Thomas John Watson Jr. Thomas John Watson Jr. was an American businessman and political figure. He was also an Air Force pilot and philanthropist, who in 1964 Fortune called him the greatest capitalist in history. Time magazine also listed him as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. He was the son of Thomas John Watson Sr., who founded IBM. He was also the second company president from 1952 to 1971. He was also the 16th United States ambassador to the Soviet Union and the 11th national president of the Boy Scouts of America. Post-World War II, when Thomas John Watson Jr. took over, was during IBM's most explosive period of growth. He led the company from the age of mechanical tabulators and typewriters into the computer era. During his time as chief executive officer, he employed 72,500 people and had a gross income of $882 million. Up to the time that Watson Jr. took over, IBM was dedicated to electromechanical punch card system for its commercial products. His father had repeatedly rejected electronic computers as overpriced and unreliable, except for one-of-a-kind projects such as the IBM SSEC. Watson Jr. took the company into a new direction, hiring electrical engineers by hundreds and putting them to work designing mainframe computers. Many of IBM's technical experts also did not think computer products were practical, since they were the only about a dozen computers in the entire world at the time. Even the supporters of the new technology underestimated the potential. Even so, until the late 1950s, the custom-built U.S. Air Force Sage computer tracking system accounted for more than half of IBM's computer sales. The company made little profit on these sales, but as Watson Jr. said, it enabled us to build highly automated factories ahead of anybody else, and to train thousands of new workers in electronics. Watson Jr.'s decision was justified. In the long term, it redirected IBM its later position dominating computer market. Even in the short term, it paid off, for revenues more than tripled in 6 years, from $214.9 million in 1950 to $734.8 million in 1956. This dramatic rate of growth almost matched the wartime years. A better than 30% compound growth rate than Tom Jr. maintained for much of the 20 years of leadership at IBM. It took a record even better than that of his father. Despite the presence of his son, Thomas Sr. kept a firm grip on the reins until 1955. Thomas Jr. described the position of his father as he wanted to make him head of IBM. He didn't like sharing the limelight. Watson Jr. took over the effort's control in a dramatic moment, though the formal handover took place a few months later. The occasion was signing the consent decree, which is offered to the government after the latest antitrust investigation. Watson Jr. saw the consent decree, which sought to strip IBM in half card-making capacity, was largely irrelevant, since the future was in the company, not cards. There was another condition. IBM had to sell machines outright as well as leave them. This had repercussions in the late 1960s, when leasing companies recognized the financial loophole that it created. Behind the decision was another spending more than research development. IBM was only spending 3% on research and development, and the time when other high technology companies were spending between 6% and 9%. Watson Jr. learned the lesson thereafter, and at least until the 1990s, when IBM consistently spent 9%. By comparison, the equivalent figure of Japan was 5.1%. highly technological companies exceeding the IBM level. This training program was to take over the next 5 years to the IBM operating group. Watson Jr. believed was the most important influential was Albert Lynn Williams, a CPA who became president of IBM in 1961. Although the initiative, as much as credit birth of the information revolution, must go to Watson Jr., considerable courage was also displayed at his then aging father, who, despite the long-term commitment to internal funding, backed his son to Hill reportedly with the words, "It is harder to keep a business great than it is to build it." So, during his time as CEO of IBM, he revolutionized the technology business.